Students often ask me, what's the best way to pick up a new language? And I think it's best to start at the beginning. How do we actually acquire languages? In this presentation, we're going to talk about input, comprehensible input, what the affective filter is, what intake is, the approach immersion versus submersion, storytelling as input, and the role of output in acquisition. Now, we all acquire languages the same way. And what is that? We read and hear messages that are easy to understand in L2. So if you're learning Spanish, you want to hear and read as many understandable messages, comprehensible messages as you can in Spanish. If you're learning Portuguese, you want to hear as much as you can in Portuguese and read as much as you can in Portuguese. If you're learning French, the same thing. You want to hear and read as much as you can in L2. What that means is you have to get a lot of input. Input is the stream of language that you hear or read. Right now, there's a stream of language that's coming at you, and that language is English. Now, you're listening and you're understanding, you're reading some text that's on the screen, and those are the inputs that you're receiving right now. It's that stream of language that you hear or read. It's not necessarily language that you understand, but it's the language that's coming at you. The more that you get input, the more your brain takes that input and tries to build a mental model of the language. It's like when you try to make a model car. It's not exactly a working car, perhaps, but it is a car nonetheless, and it looks like the real thing. The same thing, your brain takes the input that it receives and tries to build a mental model, a mental representation of what the language looks like, the structure of it, the consistency of the language, the sounds, etc. Comprehensible input is the language stream that's coming at you, but that it's easy to understand. It's the language that you hear and understand. It's the language that you read and understand. It's the comprehensible input. And this is a critical piece. If you can't understand the language that you hear, and if you can't understand the language that you read, it's input, but your brain kind of filters it out and says, hey, I'm not sure what that is. Let's come back to this another time. Let's learn this another time. Intake, then, is the language that's available for acquisition. What that means is your brain took the comprehensible input, it processed it internally. It takes the language that you hear, takes the language that you read, it processes it, and if it's understandable, then it's ready for acquisition. It's there. Now, you might not acquire it right away. You might hear language and understand it and not pick it up right then. But it's available at that point. Once it's been converted from input, you've understood it, you've processed it mentally, it's available for acquisition. Now, there's a problem. The problem is called the affective filter. Now, the affective filter is anything that can get in the way of the input stream, and so this can take the form of many, many things. Maybe you're uncomfortable. Maybe you have to go to the bathroom, maybe you're hungry, maybe you didn't sleep well last night, just you're kind of uncomfortable. Could be a distraction. Could be that you're thinking about a fight that you had with a significant other. It could be any number of distractions. Multitasking or task switching. When we try to do two things at once, we do both things poorly. That's generally what happens. That's why when you text and drive at the same time, it's a bad idea because you're going to get into an accident. Incomprehensible language can raise the affective filter. It's often stressful for someone picking up a new language to hear language they don't understand or read language they don't have to understand, and to need to respond to that language, that's a stressor for many people. Stress in general is the thing that we're trying to avoid. In other words, we want to get as much comprehensible input as we can, give it time, and do this in a low-stress environment. That will put us in that intake phase over and over and over again. That's where we want to live. We want to live in that intake phase where we've heard language, we've read language, we've understood it, we've processed it mentally. We're not stressed out at all. And over time, that leads to acquisition. What that means is you want to create an environment for yourself that is immersive. You want 100% L2 if possible. So if you're learning Spanish, you want to have 100% Spanish if that's possible. Now, you might not understand every word, but you want to be able to give yourself as many opportunities as you can to process the language, understand it if you can, and convert it to intake where it's ready for acquisition, where it's ready for you to pick up that language and have it be part of your language system, your mental model of the language. Here's where a lot of problems come in when you're trying to pick up a language. There's submersion versus immersion. Submersion. Submersion is like being taught to swim by being dropped in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. You might learn how to swim, but chances are you're going to need some help. The Coast Guard's going to have to come save you or you're going to drown. When you're trying to learn to swim in this analogy, immersion is probably a better choice because you're going to be fully immersed in the water, but you're going to be in the shallow end. You'll be able to put your feet down if you need to, and you'll be with an experienced instructor that's going to help you figure out how to stay buoyant in the water. Likewise, when you're learning a new language, immersion is probably the better choice because it's a low-stress environment that gets you fully immersed in the language. Telling stories is one of my favorite vehicles for comprehensible input. When you tell a story in a new language and you hear a story in a new language, you're going to be exposed to lots of high-frequency vocabulary. Words like want, have, go, be. Those kinds of words come up all of the time. And furthermore, it's a very natural way to pick up a language. We are storytelling creatures. For thousands of years, our ancestors have been telling stories in oral traditions across the globe. Stories resonate with us. And if you can learn the language through hearing stories and through telling stories, you're going to pick up language just like little kids pick up language. Hearing stories, reading stories, having stories read to them over and over and over again. And little kids don't just learn the stories, they learn them by heart. And when you learn something by heart, it requires no work to memorize. What's the role of output when you're talking about picking up a new language? Output definitely has a role, but what is the role? Well, to talk about this, I like to talk about the 80-20 rule, also known as the Pareto principle. And the Pareto principle, the 80-20 rule, comes from an Italian economist who discovered that 80% of the peas came from just 20% of the pods in his garden. One day he just noticed that most of the peas came from a small percentage of the pods. Pareto was able to make some very profound extrapolations from this. Pareto discovered that this distribution presented itself throughout nature in various domains. Sometimes it can be even more skewed. Sometimes it's 90-10, or famously, 99% of the world's wealth is held by just 1% of the population. When this comes to language acquisition, which is the part that gives us the most bang for our buck? What is the thing that is going to give us the most acquisition for the least amount of work? For me, 99% of your acquisition is going to come from input, and 1% is going to come from output. Now, maybe the numbers are a little off. Maybe it's 90-10 or 95-5, but the idea is that the main thing, the money maker for you, is going to be getting lots and lots of input. Now, output does do something, so it's very important, but output can take various forms. Basically, what you want to do with output is just do something with the input that you receive. Speaking is one, obviously. Writing is another. So maybe you hear something and then you write a response to that. Non-linguistic output is fine too. Checking boxes, filling out a survey, doing a gesture, acting out language is another thing that you can do. So the output is an important piece, and you will need to do some output, but know that the input is the thing that's going to get you more acquisition. So the more input that you get, the more opportunities you give yourself to process the language and to pick up that language to incorporate it into your mental model. Output can more solidify what you already have, and it can be a demonstration of what you've already picked up. It can be evidence that you've picked up language.